Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at a source that really gets to the heart of things. It's a monograph called The Structural and Constitutional Imperative, Reaffirming Bharat as a Sanatan Hindu Nation by Dr. Ryan Baidya.
It's a dense one, and our goal today is to really get into its central argument. The author claims that political self-rule, Swaraj, is incomplete if the state doesn't structurally acknowledge its own civilizational foundation.
Which the source identifies as Sanatan Dharma.
Exactly. The idea is that you need to reclaim the nation's ethos, its Swa-Dharma, to have real political stability.
So this is much more than a historical look back. It's a critique of the modern Indian constitution itself.
Yeah.
What's the core shift the author is actually proposing?
Well, the main claim is that the word secularism, specifically its insertion and how it's been applied, created a kind of a break, a philosophical and structural break that, the author says, undermines national identity.
And the proposed solution is a shift to what they call a Dharmic republic.
Right. A framework rooted in indigenous ethics, which they argue is the only way to get real stability and cultural authenticity.
But the first question that pops into my head, and probably for a lot of our listeners, is about majoritarianism.
Of course. And the monograph tackles that head-on. It argues that this kind of constitutional recognition would actually protect minority rights.
How so?
Not despite being a Dharmic republic, but because of it. The argument is that the inherent pluralism of the Sanatani ethos is already stronger and more philosophically grounded than Western-style secularism.
Okay, let's unpack that. This idea of the civilizational anchor, Sanatan Dharma. This source calls it the eternal law. How do they distinguish that from, just religion?
They define it as this ancient, enduring framework, spiritual, ethical, philosophical, that's been there for thousands of years. And the key principle, the real takeaway, is its built-in pluralism.
The idea of ekam sat vibra bahuda vadanti.
Exactly. Truth is one, but the wise call it by many names. It's a philosophical acceptance of difference from the ground up.
So that's the indigenous model. How does that contrast with political secularism, which is supposed to do the same thing, keep the peace between groups?
Dr. Baidya argues political secularism is a Western import. It came out of Europe's post-Reformation religious wars. So it's a solution to a very specific European problem.
And therefore, a mismatch for Bharat's history.
A profound mismatch. The argument is that pre-colonial governance was already anchored in these universal principles like Rita, cosmic order, and Satya, truth. So political secularism was this imported and ultimately inadequate solution.
Which leads right into this critique of the colonial hangover. We've heard that term, but here it's applied specifically to statecraft.
Precisely. The core point is that the post-independence elite, they adopted Western models for everything, bureaucracy, law, and this idea of secularism, because of what the source calls Macaulayism.
Creating a ruling class that was sort of cut off from its own political philosophy.
Yes, leading to a state that didn't have a natural cultural root. It was always borrowing and often ended up restricting the majority culture in the name of this imported neutrality.
Okay, and this is where we get to what I thought was just the most stunning piece of evidence in the monograph. It's physical proof of what the original framers might have intended.
The original hand-painted 1950 Constitution.
It's incredible. We're saying the original founding document had these beautiful illustrations of ancient figures.
Directed by the artist Nandalal Bose, yes. It's hard to argue with. It's visual evidence of an intended civilizational continuity.
And in the section on fundamental rights, part 3, it's illustrated with Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana returning to Ayodhya. Why that image for rights?
It's symbolic. It anchors the whole concept of rights, not in some abstract political deal, but in the ideal of Dharmic governance, Rama Raja. It suggests rights flow from a just, ethical, civilizational ideal.
And then for the directive principles, which are the state's moral goals, we see Krishna giving the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna on the battlefield. I mean, that's not subtle.
No, it's not. It's a clear signal that ethical statecraft, principles like Dharma Yuddha, the ethical struggle, and Karma Yoga, action without attachment, that these should be guiding policy.
And the author makes a big deal of this.
A huge deal. Dr. Baidya says the later, deliberate removal of these images from common reproductions of the Constitution is a form of cultural erasure. It adds to the confusion of identity.
That's a powerful point. Let's shift from the symbolic to the purely legal, because the monograph makes a very serious attack on the preamble itself. It calls it a legal forgery.
That's the term used, yes. And it's a profound accusation. It all hinges on the 42nd Amendment Act of 1976.
Okay, so the original preamble from 1949, it established India as a sovereign democratic republic.
Correct, but the words socialist and secular weren't there.
They were added later.
Decades later, in 1976, during the emergency. And the author's charge of dishonesty comes from this. The preamble we all read today still has the 1949 adoption date at the bottom.
So it makes it seem like secular was there from the very beginning, agreed upon by everyone.
When it wasn't. It's presented as part of the original consensus, and the source argues it absolutely was not.
But wasn't the idea behind those amendments to, modernize the state, to make its inclusive nature official?
That would be the counter-argument, yes. But the source sees it as dishonest because it misrepresents history. And more importantly, it argues that this imported secularism has led to governance that is anything but neutral in practice.
Okay, so how does the monograph back that up? The claim that Indian secularism became state management and control of the majority religion.
The main evidence cited is the network of laws known as the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowments Acts, the HRNCE Acts.
And what do these do on the ground?
They give state governments huge administrative and, crucially, financial control over temple trusts and their properties.
And this is different for other religions?
Profoundly different, according to the source. Mosques and churches generally have full financial and administrative autonomy. This difference is presented as a direct contradiction of state neutrality.
The source also mentions the diversion of funds, right?
Yes, that this state control allegedly leads to temple funds being used for non-religious state projects, which in turn starves actual cultural institutions like traditional Vedic schools.
Are there specific articles in the Constitution that are pointed to as problems?
Two really stand out in the text. First, Article 25(2)(a), which is used to let the state regulate economic, financial, or other secular activity, but in practice, this is almost exclusively applied to the majority faith.
And the second one?
Article 290(a). This one is, well, it's pretty direct. It mandates annual payments from the state to the Devaswam Fund for certain Hindu temples in Kerala and Tamil Nadu.
So a supposedly neutral state is making direct payments to religious institutions.
Exactly. The source asks, how can the state be neutral if its relationship with the majority faith is so deeply regulatory and financial? It's a contradiction.
Okay, let's move to what the monograph calls the most profound failure of this system. The failure at uniformity. This is about the Uniform Civil Code.
It is, yes. The UCC. The fact that it's still not implemented, even though it's mandated by Article 44, is called out as a fundamental failure of the promise of equality.
Because you still have different personal laws for different communities.
Right. Separate laws for Hindus, Muslims, Christians, parses on things like marriage, divorce, inheritance. This means citizens are treated differently by the law based on their religion, which goes against the whole idea of equality.
And the source connects this to what it calls minority privilege, especially in education.
Yes, through Article 30. This gives religious and linguistic minorities the right to establish and run their own educational institutions.
It seems reasonable on the surface.
Of course. But the critique is about how it's been interpreted by the courts. The argument is that it has given minority-run institutions way more autonomy over their curriculum, hiring fees, than majority-run institutions get. It's presented as an unjustifiable privilege.
And there are specific laws that are also cited as creating imbalance. Can you give us a couple of examples?
Two big ones are brought up. First, the Places of Worship Act from 1991. It basically freezes the religious character of any place of worship as it was in 1947.
Which restricts the majority's ability to reclaim historical sites.
That's the argument. The second is the Waqf Act of 1995, which gives Muslim Waqf boards extensive and often very controversial authority over large areas of land. These are shown as examples of the state not being a neutral actor.
And then there's the classic case study, the Shah Bono case. For listeners who might not know the details of that 1980s crisis, what's the summary?
It's a landmark case. The Supreme Court granted maintenance rights to a divorced Muslim woman, Shah Bono, based on secular law, a major victory for women's rights.
But that's not where it ended.
No. The ruling was overturned by an act of parliament, the Muslim Women Act of 1986, after political pressure. The source uses this as the ultimate example of political concession overriding secular legal principles.
If the diagnosis is a constitutional and structural failure, the prescription is this Dharmic republic. What does that actually look like in terms of changes?
It starts with the preamble, replacing secular with Dharmic or maybe civilizational republic.
A symbolic change.
Symbolic but foundational. Then, 3 major functional steps. First, ensure full financial and administrative autonomy for all religious institutions, ending state control over temples. Second, mandatory implementation of the Uniform Civil Code.
And the third.
The third is really the overarching goal, harmonizing all the fundamental rights to reflect these changes.
But then we're back to the original question. If the state officially aligns itself with an indigenous ethos, how does Dr. Bhatia argue minorities are protected? Why is a Dharmic guarantee better than a secular one?
The argument is that the guarantee is stronger because it's rooted in the ethos itself. It's not political, it's philosophical.
Based on concepts like
Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family, and ahimsa, non-harm. The contention is that this ancient non-political mandate is a much stronger firewall against persecution than a politically weak secularism that, as we saw with Charbonneau, can be overturned for political reasons.
So let's end with the philosophical blueprint for all of this. The author suggests using an ancient framework for modern governance.
Yes, the Purusharthas, the 4 aims of life: dharma, righteous conduct; artha, prosperity; kama, desire; and moksha, liberation.
And the key is the hierarchy between them.
That's the key. The structure demands that artha, economic growth, and kama, desire, must always be subject to dharma, to ethical and moral considerations. This provides the built-in checks and balances that the author says the current political structure just doesn't have.
This has been a really complex deep dive. It connects all these legal and historical points back to a single fundamental question. Can a state be authentic if it denies its own foundational civilization? If it treats its own history like just another competing religion?
That is the absolute core of the thesis. The conclusion is that by constitutionally recognizing Sanatan Dharma, Bharat reclaims its full sovereignty, not just politically Swaraj, but civilizationally Swa-Dharma. And that, the author believes, is the only path to real, deep structural stability.
And for you, the listener, we'll leave you with a final thought from the source. Think about the global reach of these ideas. The Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita had a profound influence on American transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau, and even on physicists like Oppenheimer and Schrödinger. They all saw these texts as offering universal, secularly relevant insights. So the question the monograph poses is this: if these philosophical principles are so widely admired as universal wisdom, shouldn't they be considered suitable anchors for governance in their own land of origin? It asks you to consider the Sanatan tradition as maybe far more than a religion, but the actual civilizational bedrock of a nation.